Thanks for watching Endgame Economics. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. It's completely free for you, and it helps us continue making more videos like this.
Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are doing an absolute deep dive into the complex bureaucracy and, let's be honest, intense geopolitical drama behind a brand literally everyone recognizes but very few people actually understand. We're talking about UNESCO. Now, from the outside, it kind of just looks like a noble institution that stamps plaques on pretty buildings, right? But on the inside, it is this incredibly complicated, maybe slightly leaky machine sitting right at the absolute center of modern geopolitics.
To really grasp the massive gap between the dream and the reality here, we actually need to look back to 1945. An American poet and delegate, Archibald MacLeish, wrote this incredibly lofty, beautiful sentence for the agency's founding constitution. Seriously, it's the kind of sentence you carve straight into marble. And 80 years later, well, that marble sits in a modernist building over in Paris. But here is the stark reality today. The very country whose poet wrote that sentence, they've just walked out the door for the third time. The United States is officially withdrawing from the agency, effective the end of December 2026.
So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the post-war origin story. Then, we'll go inside the UNESCO machine itself. After that, the World Heritage Empire, followed by follow the money. Then, we'll look beyond the pretty buildings, and finally, we'll break down the true cost of leaving.
All right, Section 1, the post-war origin story rebuilding from the rubble.
To really understand what UNESCO is, you have to picture the world back in 1945. Europe is totally flattened, schools are destroyed, and Allied education ministers come to this realization. Just rebuilding walls? It isn't going to cut it. Their core insight was that 2 world wars didn't just happen because of weapons. No, they happened because of ideas. The textbooks and curriculums being taught to kids, the belief was simple. Change the textbooks, change the ideas, and you literally prevent future wars. But, and this is a big but, this founding philosophy created a core tension that drives the agency's entire history. See, UNESCO started its life as a Western project, built by Westerners for Westerners. It was basically an Atlantic clubhouse founded by the US, the UK, and France. However, as massive decolonization happened throughout the 60s and 70s, the membership quietly tripled. Dozens of newly independent states from Africa and Asia joined up. Suddenly, the Western founders were regularly getting outvoted by the very institution they created. This huge shift, from a Western clubhouse to a true multipolar reality, is the exact engine driving basically every single controversy the agency faces today.
Moving on to Section 2, inside the UNESCO machine, opening the hood of a global bureaucracy. You know, when most people think of UNESCO, they probably picture academics in turtlenecks debating architecture, right? Well, in reality, it's effectively a small to medium government in exile. It comes completely equipped with its own parliament, its own cabinet, and a massive civil service, operating mostly out of Paris but with dozens of field offices all over the planet. If you look at how it's structured, right at the top you have the General Conference, that's the parliament, where 194 member states each get exactly 1 vote. Then there's the Executive Board, which essentially acts like a cabinet. They're the ones who nominate the Director General, the Chief Executive. And what's super fascinating here is the recent, genuinely historic 2025 election of Director General Khaled El-Vellani. He's an Egyptologist and a former Egyptian minister, and he won a decisive 172 out of 174 votes. Having the first Arab Director General alongside a management team that leans heavily toward the Global South, well, it shows a very clear, undeniable power shift away from those original Atlantic founders. And underneath all of this, the Secretariat. That's a civil service of about 2,300 employees making the whole shebang actually run.
Section 3. The World Heritage Empire, the power and peril of a global plaque.
Now, this whole World Heritage thing, it actually all started with a wonderfully insane project back in 1959 to physically cut and move Egypt's 3,300-year-old Abu Simbel temples just to save them from a massive flood. It was a stunning international success, and it directly inspired the creation of the 1972 World Heritage Convention. And the sheer scale behind that success today is absolutely staggering. As of recent counts, there are 1,248 World Heritage sites across the globe. But you have to understand, this isn't just some vanity list. It carries massive economic power. Take Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Before its listing in 1992, it saw maybe 22,000 visitors a year. Today, it's projected at 5 million. I mean, it practically runs the country's tourism economy. But paradoxically, that incredible influx of tourists is now threatening the site's water table and actually destabilizing the temple's foundations. The very listing that was supposed to protect it is kind of slowly destroying it through sheer popularity. So how do they enforce their rules? Well, the agency wields some very real geopolitical cudgels through its World Heritage in Danger list. It acts as a highly effective global shaming mechanism. UNESCO famously clashed with Vienna, literally threatening their status over a planned high-rise ice rink, and they absolutely follow through. In 2021, they outright stripped Liverpool of its World Heritage status because the city just went ahead with a waterfront redevelopment that destroyed its historical value. They essentially forced a city to choose between UNESCO status and office buildings. And well, Liverpool chose the buildings.
All right, Section 4, follow the money, the leaky two-engine system. Because let's face it, none of this works without someone writing the checks. And understanding these financial dependencies is absolutely key to understanding every single ounce of geopolitical drama in the organization. The real crux lies in how the budget breaks down. They operate on a massive $1.81 billion biannual budget, but look at how it's split. Only about $610 million comes from regular, legally binding assessed dues. The U.S. portion of that is statutorily capped at 22%. But the remaining $1.2 billion? That comes from voluntary contributions. Over the last decade, there has been a massive explosion in voluntary checks from players like the UAE, the European Union, and China. This has completely reshaped the agency's dependencies. It's basically a system deliberately rebuilt to survive shocks.
And the biggest shock almost always comes from the United States. Seriously, the US treats this agency like a toxic ex on a smartphone, just constantly blocking and unblocking them over the decades. Reagan exited in '84, citing mismanagement. Then Bush rejoined in 2003 as a part of a post-9/11 engagement strategy. Then a major funding freeze hit in 2011, which eventually led to Trump's exit in 2017. Biden rejoined and paid back the dues in 2023. And now, a third exit is scheduled for the end of 2026. It's a wildly chaotic timeline.
So what actually happened in 2011? The mechanical crux of the modern drama really centers on a specific trigger that year. When the General Conference voted to admit Palestine as a full member state, it wasn't just a political disagreement. It actually tripped pre-existing American public laws passed way back in 1990 and 1994. Those laws automatically prohibited funding to any UN entity that admitted the PLO. There was no waiver available, no wiggle room. The funding cutoff of that 22% was statutorily automatic, instantly and deeply distorting the financial reality of the entire agency.
Section 5, beyond the pretty buildings, the reality on the ground. You know, it is incredibly easy to get totally caught up in the political noise and the funding crises, but we need to consider these massive ongoing achievements that happen while everyone is busy yelling at each other. The stakes on the ground are incredibly real and substantial. For instance, they launched an initiative that raised $115 million, heavily funded by the UAE and the EU, by the way, just to physically rebuild the historic city of Mosul after ISIS destroyed it. They adopted the very first global AI ethics framework in 2021. They run Holocaust education and anti-Semitism training in over 30 countries. They protect the memory of the world, preserving vital documents like Anne Frank's diary. But perhaps most staggeringly, they coordinate the Pacific and Indian Ocean tsunami warning systems. The infrastructure established after the horrific 2004 tsunami routes coastal alerts directly through UNESCO. Honestly, that warning network alone justifies the agency's entire annual budget.
And finally, Section 6, the cost of leaving, the future of a multipolar agency.
So what exactly happens when a superpower decides to pack up its funding, grab its nameplate, and just go home? The strategic reality is actually quite simple. Withdrawal does not bring neutrality. The agency doesn't just stop working, it just allows new patrons to take the wheel. With the US leaving again in 2026, influence naturally flows to whoever fills that financial void. That means countries like China and Gulf states are increasing their voluntary contributions, and in return, they get to sit at the table and set the global rules for the next century on critical issues like artificial intelligence frameworks, ocean governance, and educational standards.
So the real bottom line to take away from all this source material is that multilateral institutions are inherently messy. UNESCO is a massive bureaucracy. It can be deeply infuriating and highly politicized to specific member states. But historically, the alternative, 194 countries engaging in uncoordinated global chaos, is vastly worse. History proves over and over again that the cost of being absent from these institutions is almost always higher than the cost of just staying in the room and arguing your case.
I want to wrap up this explainer by leaving you with a really provocative question to think about. If you abandon the global rules-setting room, are you prepared to live by the rules someone else writes? It's a fascinating dynamic that challenges all of us to rethink the true cost of global withdrawal.
Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the machine and the drama of UNESCO. I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this. Drop your insights in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next explainer.